trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koop Cast. As always, I am your humble host, Coach Jason Koop. And on this episode of the podcast, I gathered our crack team of coaches together, and we are going to swallow our pride and eat a little bit of crow and go through some of the most egregious mistakes that we made through this past year, and more importantly, how we are going to correct them. So on the podcast today, I have a team of Sarah Scozzaro, Ryne Anderson, and Nicole Rasmussen, and we each picked some of the worst mistakes that we made, the context that wraps around those mistakes, and how we are going to correct them. You longtime listeners of the podcast will recognize that nearly in every single episode, I recognize something in the past that I have done incorrectly and how I have gone through a course correction in order to correct that mistake. I am not infallible. In fact, one of the reasons that I am at where I am at today is making all of those mistakes when I was a younger coach, bringing in expert counsel and correcting those mistakes so that I don't make them in the future. So I hope, regardless of whether you're an athlete directing your own training or you're a coach directing other athletes' training listening to this podcast, that you can take a little bit of inspiration from not only what we did wrong, but actually how we came into correcting it so that you can apply it to whatever situation is actually in front of you. All right, folks, with that out of the way, I am getting right out of the way. Here's our coach roundtable about what mistakes we made and how we corrected them.
If anybody here was raised Catholic, this sort of feels like confession mixed with a healthy dose of Catholic guilt. So forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. Here's what I did this past year.
I'm sure there's a number of different analogies we're going to go through. The one that I like is we're all going to eat crow for the next hour and a half, right? Mm-hmm. All right. So Nicole gets the first bite of the crow. Nicole, why don't you kick us off here? What did you screw up this year? And be honest with it.
Yeah, I actually shared this story in a continuing ed with our coaches, but I feel like it's just come up so frequently in the ultra running world that I wanted to, share it today too. But if you're not aware, and if you don't know, the World Anti-Doping Agency has IV fluids listed on their, their list of prohibited substances. Right. And so you can't get an IV in or out of competition except for like a legitimate medical reason in a legitimate medical facility. And the reason for that, right, is that you can enhance your performance by increasing blood plasma volume. And you can also mask banned substances by taking in a lot of IV fluids. So if you're not aware, that's the situation. I had an example this year where I went out to a race. After the fact, I had an athlete who mentioned to me, like, oh, you should have been here earlier. I got my IV fluids right before the race, right? This person had a medical background and had the ability to like administer their own IV, and just thought like, this is a great idea. Why not start the race super hydrated? And so, I think it'd be really easy to say as a coach, I wasn't there, I didn't know, or, I wasn't aware. And I don't think the mistake was made by the athlete, right? This athlete was not trying to dope or cheat on purpose, right? Like they were just unaware and uneducated, and that this was something that's against the rules. And so the mistake wasn't made by the athlete. I feel like the mistake was made by me as the coach in failing to like cast a wide enough net and a wide enough umbrella of education and example to like all of my athletes. As coaches, we definitely have a role in mentoring and educating our athletes, and it's our job to put our best athletes on the line without the use of any performance enhancing measures. It's our job to have integrity and to promote clean sport. And I think that it's easy to have these conversations sometimes with your elite athletes or your professional athletes, and it's easy to make sure that you're covering your bases and kind of keeping some of these things from happening. But there really is opportunity as coaches and leaders in the field to make sure that we are educating and casting a wide enough net so that everybody knows. And so, we talk about, we make mistakes. What are we going to do differently? And I think it's pretty easy in an onboarding situation with an athlete, or, in the intake form with your athlete, to just ask the question up front, like, what medications do you take? What supplements do you take? What, and it just starts the conversation from the start. So you make sure you cover your bases and are able to kind of have some of those conversations with athletes from day one.
Nicole's like coming out swinging with this. I thought people were going to come to like with it. Like my long run was, 8 hours instead of 7 hours or something kind of like trivial like this. Like Nicole comes out with the doping piece right out of the gate.
But like, don't you feel like, even like if you follow Koop, every Wednesday somebody asks you this question, like, what do you think about an IV before a race? And
sure. So to add a little bit, let me add some like context to this right here, just based on my, on my experience, and we can kind of bat it around the room. So Nicole, you're right. That rule is in place. It was one of the original anti-doping rules that WADA initially put in place, because way back when WADA was kind of concerned with basically two classes of performance enhancing drugs. One of them was anabolic steroids, mainly in strength and power sports, but also somewhat in the endurance sports. And the other one was blood doping. And the only tool that the anti-doping officials had at the time, when this was when this was instrumented very early on to combat blood doping, was hematocrit. That's all they did. And they set this very somewhat arbitrary threshold in the very early days of anti-doping efforts that said if your hematocrit was above 50, then that was a red flag. You just couldn't have it. And that's not the best way to do it. We have way more sophisticated tools now to track down blood doping. But in the old days, when this initially started, that was the only tool. And so the athletes that were doping and the doctors that were managing the doping protocols, they were kind of smart, and they were like, listen, we can manipulate this hematocrit, very easily by just giving somebody an IV. So hematocrit is just the ratio of red blood cell volume to total blood cell, or to total plasma volume. And by simply infusing saline into the bloodstream, you're automatically diluting it, and then you can kind of go below that 50 hematocrit, which would be half and half red blood cell volume, half total, or then the red cell volume comprises half of the total plasma volume. And so my point was that was a very easy way to circumvent the rules, and that the no needles, no IV policy has really persisted since then, but it has very early origins. So it's one of the oldest rules, like if you want to kind of put it into historical context. And that's juxtaposed by the way that we think about the innocuous IV now, that first off is used in legitimate medical setting for a number of different reasons, to rehydrate, just to keep a patient stable and things like that. And if you're under the supervision, if you're under the care of a physician, and that's a necessary medical intervention, by all means, go ahead and do that. We're not saying like avoid that at all costs, but to simply do it to rehydrate after a race or prehydrate in advance of a race, irrespective of the efficacy of those interventions. We're going to put that aside for a second. That would certainly be an anti-doping violation, and one that a lot of athletes view as relatively innocuous, right? Because it seems benign. I'm just literally injecting myself with saline or a saline drip. But it is a big problem in the anti-doping world. Not necessarily to mask things now, because there are better ways to go about that, but mainly because of what you just mentioned, Nicole, is just the undereducation that it actually is a method that is controlled or prohibited by WADA. So I'm going to do all the listeners a favor, and I'm going to put 2 resources up in the show notes if you're curious about this stuff. The first is USADA's Anti-Doping 101 resource, and they have resources for both athletes and coaches. So you can pick your flavor of that. I would encourage athletes and coaches to look at both. That will give you a general orientation of how the anti-doping process works, where to go for other resources and things like that. And the second one, and this one is actually, I think, the kind of the most important tool that you can have in your toolkit, and it's called the Global DRO, or the Global DRO. And all it is a resource that's in several different languages that any athlete or any coach or any practitioner from any sport that can use. And it is a huge database of all of the medications and compounds and substances. I almost said supplements. That's not true. Substances that exist in all of their chemical and colloquial formats. So if you look up Tylenol, for example, it will show you the same thing as acetaminophen, right? You don't have to be a sophisticated doctor and look up all of the technical names for things. And it will tell you whether or not those substances are approved out of competition, banned out of competition, banned in competition, under what conditions they are, because some are conditionally approved. It will give you resources if some can be approved through the TUE process. And something that I'm having all of my, and I have had for the last few years, to be honest with you, all of my elite athletes do whenever they have anything new is run it through the Global DRO. Even if I know and they know that it is it's going to be approved in all conditions, just to set the habit of doing that. Because the last thing you want to have happen is somebody gets some random heart medication for a legitimate medical condition and not go through this process in advance and run into a problem after the fact and have to try to retroactively declare TUE, which usually causes some sort of anti-doping infraction of varying types of penalties or varying length of the penalties. And it's just problematic kind of across the board. And mark my word, I mentioned this in the coaching conference that none of you guys were at, so you guys will get the spiel now. Out of competition testing is coming to trail and ultra running. We already have in competition testing, and that's really problematic to introduce that as the first piece of anti-doping that anybody has, like right after a race. That's not a thing that a lot of anti-doping agencies want to do because of a lot of the complications with it. But out of competition testing and treating trail and ultra running similarly with a similar fashion as a lot of the other traditional Olympic sports are treated, that's coming in the next 2 to 3 years. And it is going to be an interesting process once that actually does come down the line, because it's very hard to get everybody on the same page and reading from the same playbook, even though people genuinely want to do the right thing. It's going to come with a lot of, at least initially, unintended consequences, and that's just part of the gig when you introduce anti-doping into a new sport. So kudos to you for swinging for the fences on that one, Nicole. That's definitely not one that I was anticipating, owning up to the fact that we don't script this too much. But, that's a big one.
Yeah, there you go. We'll start off big.
I don't have anything else to add. I'm still in shock.
I just appreciate that vulnerability and sharing that, Nicole, because I guarantee you, I mean, I, for one, have had an athlete, I think I mentioned to you in the past, that had mentioned to me offhand, this was like a couple of years ago, like, oh yeah, I went ahead and got some IV done before my event. And it was like, didn't even cross my mind to say something about like, you should not do that. And I think now it's something that coaches are becoming more aware of, that those are the conversations we need to have with our athletes, or that even athletes we're not coaching need to be thinking about this, that's not a protocol you should be doing. And it's not something you think about until you face it. But hopefully people will learn from people like us that, no, these are conversations to have with your athletes, and athletes should be aware of this. So I appreciate you sharing that very much.
And it's not just for the elite athletes.
No.
Right?
No,
athletes can always take on their own. They can do whatever they want to, right? They're their own. They're grown adults, as I like to say. On the elite athlete side, and especially if they are subject to some sort of rule structure, right, which includes anti-doping, Obviously they need to be a whole lot more careful because there's real consequence. There's real consequence to the race results, and there's real consequence to their career and their sponsors and their kind of like umbrella of people that they have around them. But the everyday athletes are kind of caught in the crossfire a little bit. I do think, to Sarah's point, that it's important to educate athletes on this so that they can kind of make their own decisions, but don't rule out the fact that something might appear in ultra running that's akin to what USA Cycling does. So USA Cycling does randomized drug testing, race day testing across all of the events and across all of the categories. So some random category 4 masters like me, I'm 45 years old. I'm never going to compete for an Olympic medal. I can join my local criterium with a, USA Cycling license. They could easily pull me aside, Joe Schmo, nobody, and randomly test me. That is not out of the realm of possibility a few years down the line. I'm not going to say that is likely to happen, because the thing that catalyzed that in the US and cycling is the fact that it has a national governing body, and they made it kind of one of their priorities. But I wouldn't put it past it to actually have that degree of formalization. Outside of the formalization, that formalizing process, the athletes can make their own decisions on whether or not they want to be WADA compliant or not. And that's a whole, other mess that is probably outside the scope of this podcast. And we need to bring in an ethics committee and all that stuff to tackle that. We are not going to tackle that at this time. But needless to say, I would encourage the athletes out there, whether they're an elite athlete or not, just to start to consider these things, because it's going to be part of the sport. And then also, when it is part of the sport, if you want to have an opinion on it, you're now more educated, which is also a big problem at the public at large, meaning it's really easy to cast, shadows and throw stones and things like that when you don't know anything about anything. But when you actually figure out that, hey, listen, a lot of people have been, I'll give you guys a great example. It actually happened at the Pikes Peak Marathon. So the Pikes Peak Marathon, which had anti-doping control at it, right, for the elite athletes, they're randomly testing the top 10, and probably I think they had some sort of standardized testing in the top 3 maybe. They actually had an IV provider as part of like the sponsor booth in the expo. So you have this clear, once again, that's a very clear miss with the race management, not recognizing that they had somebody providing services that was technically against the rules for the elite athletes, just for the elite athletes. Those rules, I don't even know if they actually applied to everybody. I have to go look at the Pikes Peak rule book. But the summary of that is, or the point that I'm trying to make is even you're going to see those types of that type of lack of education and those discrepancies kind of across the board. Because of the lack of education and because it's a new thing for a new sport. That always happens with new sports, where people just get caught in the crosshairs or don't realize or whatever. But I'm telling you guys, once out of competition testing comes around, people are going to get shocked and there's going to be no excuses. And I don't know what else to say about it.
We'll be ready. We'll be ahead of the curve.
We
learn from our mistakes.
Yeah. My dad used to always tell me, it's okay if you make mistakes, just don't make the same one twice. So that was a good one, Nicole. Thanks for being vulnerable. Ryne, I don't know how you're going to follow that up.
Here we go. Next. Okay. So one thing I screwed up this year was considering weather and how that is going to affect training into the long range plan. I've always been mindful of that for athletes out west who are going to be impacted by snow, but factoring in those athletes that are going to be impacted by heat and humidity in the summer, because most big races are taking place end of summer, early fall. Key blocks of training are taking place between May to July. And like I had several athletes in Houston, it was record temperatures all summer. And just their interval work is compromised. It's just the heat and humidity. Everyone was compromised. And the ability to get in quality training just wasn't there. And so being mindful of that from the get-go, of like, okay, instead of this specific block, we're focusing on high intensity. let's flip-flop that to maybe cooler months, or be proactive in the conversation and like, hey, do you have access to a treadmill? No? Okay, well, let's try to make that happen. If you don't, we're going to work around it. And yeah, being more proactive there. And when they are going to do their intervals, add recovery time to the interval. Instead of maybe going 3 interval sessions in 10 days, we space that out more, give them more recovery time. Being more deliberate of using cooling strategies in training. Don't just save them for race day and using your ice bandana, your ice sleeves and all that. Set yourself up for best success in training when it's 90 degrees and 100% humidity, and factoring in all those things. And then also with that, you can be more mindful as the heat is approaching, and like, hey, realize your paces are about to slow. Don't like start having that conversation maybe weeks later, because their confidence is going to take a hit if you aren't mindful of that ahead of time. And it can be hard to backtrack and reassure the confidence of your athlete if you haven't already addressed that, because subconsciously we know these things, but we're driven by data. We're using Training Peaks. The data is right there. When you see these changes in your paces, all of a sudden I'm not hitting the same splits for my tempo intervals, your confidence is going to take a hit. Yes, you know your performance is going to go down from the heat, but really face that a lot with a few athletes in warm climates. Like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling so slow. I'm a little more tired, and factoring in all that to get ahead of it would be one big thing I learned from, and to be more proactive.
We need to do this podcast or something similar in April to tell everybody get ready for the summer, because I think we all have athletes, and probably us ourselves, that first day that the temperature dramatically increases, everybody makes the same mistake, and they take the exact same hydration out that they took, a month earlier when the weather was 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit cooler. And that's not that material on like an hour run or an hour and a half run. But then when you do it on like a 4 or 5 hour run and you run out of fluids and you're just like, oh my God, like this, I really kind of like screwed this up. It has a cascading effect, to your point, Ryne, of you need to include extra recovery and just be mindful of it and things like that. Because not only do you have like the physiological ramifications of digging yourself a little bit of a bigger hole, now you also have the psychological ramification of I'm a lot slower, I'm performing a lot poorer. Why is that? And if you address that in advance, it is far more powerful than just stating the fact of, oh, it's hot, so you're slowing down. That psychological seed has already planted once the action has already happened. So certainly you can mitigate it a little bit after the fact with any sort of conversation, but make no mistake, like you have a bad workout, or not even a bad workout where you're unaccustomed to the paces that you're actually running, that's partially facilitated by the heat. If you know in advance going into that workout that that's going to happen, it's a whole different psychological setup than if afterwards you're wondering, why was I so terrible?
To your point that 60, 90-minute run, that's immaterial to maybe not change up your hydration strategy, I would say it is. All right. We do sweat testing with our athletes, anywhere from like 2 to 5 pounds. You go for that 60-minute run, you lose 3 pounds of sweat, and you haven't hydrated during, you're in a hole and trying to catch up the rest of the day. You finish your run at 8, you're trying to chug a bunch of water before bed, you're waking up to pee throughout the night, your sleep's compromised, and on it goes.
You're coming up with like 7 degrees of separation there, but I get your point.
Yeah.
Anybody else have that experience?
We did a lot of adapting and audibles with athletes in the South and the Southeast this year. It was a hot and humid year. So.
Do any of you use the weather app in Training Peaks? It's a feature that you can bolt on to it, and it'll show you, I think it's the 10-day forecast. So when you're actually building workouts, it'll show you like what the forecast is localized to that one particular athlete. Do you guys use that?
I've never seen that.
Yeah, I'll show you guys where it is after the call. But from a building perspective, you can't always match it up because sometimes you're building longer than that time frame. But if you're constantly checking in with the athlete and like evaluating, here's the workout, here's what I've got coming up next, sometimes it doesn't automatically flag it. But if you're looking for it, those big temperature swings you can actually like bring into your coaching practice. And all it does is it just embeds, like, I believe it's the high and low temperatures just at like the top of the each individual day square, but you have to add it onto Training Peaks. It's not something that's like there by default. Okay, any other banter on that particular topic? All right, Scozzaro.
My turn.
You're
Okay.
next.
My biggest mistake this year was assuming, which is always a good idea, that the athlete will make the best decision in when it comes to how their recovery is going. If I'm going to say that simply, had an individual training for a marathon, wanted a sub-3 goal, was doing really, really well. Everything was lining up metric wise, no issues. They had trouble, they had some travel, and then they had some poor sleep because of some kid issues with their kiddo. They would say that, oh no, I'm fine, I'm good to go. And metrics would reflect everything's fine, but they'd then put in their notes, fatigue, heavy fatigue, didn't sleep well. We talk every week. They say, no, I think I'm good. And I say, okay, well, if you're feeling this fatigue tomorrow, I want you to take that as a rest day, like kind of like, let's call an audible on that, assuming that they would make that call. And I think a couple of the other coaches that I've talked about this, that when you get these highly driven athletes, sometimes they see that workout, they're like, I know coach said to take a rest day if I need it, but I'll power through. I can do it because it's on the calendar. I had to eventually step in and be like, this is a rest day. And later on, they're like, thank you for making that call, because I wouldn't do it myself, but it took me a longer than it should have for me to start making that call for this individual. Not because any metrics were reflecting this, but because they were just constantly making comments about fatigue and travel and whatnot. And then they were getting sick. And then they were missing training because of sickness. So it was really just having to be those guardrails for those really driven athletes. So I'm not going to give you that. This isn't a choose your own adventure day. This is you're taking a rest day. And here's why. I've got quite a few athletes that you give them the choice and they'll be like, oh, I got a rest day. Thank you. Like, that's great. And then others are like, absolutely not. If it's an option, I'm going to do the training day. Don't let me pick. Don't leave me up to my own devices. And so you have to step in and say, no, this needs to be a rest day because this is, what I'm seeing. And this is how you're responding to training. Just by the conversations.
Were you only using this? Were you only using the subjective feedback to make that call?
Yeah, at that time. Yeah, I had to, because what happened was paces were being hit, but he would comment that they felt harder than they should have. Mm-hmm. So he was still hitting the paces. He was still hitting the workouts, but it felt harder than it should have. Legs felt heavy. Sleep wasn't good. And then he got a cold and then he recovered. And then he got another, it's like this, we started having this pattern. And so even though he was doing the workouts, it was costing him a lot more than it should have. So we just had to start institute some rest days, extra rest days. He has one a week, but he's more of we needed to have 2 with everything going on. And that was hard at first, but it's definitely been a lesson of that subjective feedback is so important in having those conversations with our athletes, because the metrics don't always tell the whole story.
So what's the learning lesson to get ahead of that next time? Right.
Oh, having the athletes that I have the most conversation and communication with, that's paramount, because if you're having those conversations and asking those questions, you're going to be able to get ahead of those things. Not letting it get that far. I've kind of instituted, if I see more than 2 or 3 days where they've said, poor sleep, this feels harder, then it's like, okay, we need to probably have that extra rest day or lighten the day or reduce some intensity. If it becomes more of a trend thing. And if it's more than 2 or 3 days where I'm seeing that, I want to get ahead of that early.
I think one of the things that helps with that is looking at the training period over like a 6 or an 8 week time frame.
Yeah. Because
to the psychology that you just mentioned, oh my God, I don't want to miss this one workout. It's very, very rarely entirely evaporates into thin air. Most of the time what happens is, if you look at the architecture that you either have planned, either formally in Training Peaks is what we use, more kind of like informally in more of a long range plan, is that stress can be rearranged. So it either appears in some form or fashion 2 weeks down the line, 3 weeks down the line, 4 weeks down the line. And that's really what matters, is just things over long periods of time. So one of the ways that I've actually combated that is to try to switch the athlete's psychology, not to just what they're doing that week, but kind of what we've got for the next 4 or 5 weeks. So the audibles are a little bit more palatable because they know that there's flexibility down the road. Sometimes it's a 1-to-1 replacement, right? We're just like doing a rest day over here and we're moving that workout to the end of the phase, or kind of jerry rigging things, in some other form or fashion. But the point is it very rarely 100% evaporates into thin air, because your body can only handle so much stress over long periods of time.
Yeah.
And so if you're removing that stress over a short period of time, 2 or 3 days, right, where that's the time frame that you're looking at making that change, it gives the body the opportunity, or the athlete the opportunity, to do more stress somewhere down the line where it's actually smarter. And then you add to the fact that, like, not that we should get into like this like total optimization pattern, but especially when you're doing hard workouts, it's always more advantageous to do a hard workout when you're the most ready for that hard workout, not when you've got 5 or 6 other things kind of conspiring against you to like to do that workout. So sometimes it actually ends up working out better when you make those adjustments, because the workouts are higher quality.
Agreed. And that, luckily with this athlete, we were able to turn things around, but it's been not only a lesson just for this individual, but for some of my higher achiever, the people that are just really, really want to push hard all the time. And we've been able to turn that around with his current block of training too. So we've completely changed how we're doing it in terms of me being those firm guardrails for him. And he's responding really, really well to it. So it's been like really nice to see that, the difference between the spring and now, and just, it's just been really good to see that. So
Scozzaro's got the hammer coming down. I think she kind of likes that. Just like, give me the power.
Well, I mean, if anybody knows me, I think Ryne and I were talking about this. It's hard sometimes, because you never want an athlete to feel like you don't believe in them, or that they're not capable. And so you have to have those conversations. It's not that you can't handle this. It's just right now, you're either communicating to me, or I'm seeing something in your training that this is not the opportune time for this. And we need to reevaluate and just make it so that it's going to be, like you said, maybe next week, an extra day, rest day this week is going to make you stronger next week. And then you'll get those quality sessions in. It's not because you don't believe in your athlete. It's like you want the best for them. So you have to be those guardrails and that voice of reason at times.
Or let's make a better decision.
Yeah.
Right. It's not that you can't handle it. Let's just make the best decision.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've actually said that exact phrase to athletes when I've had to make those manipulations. It's like, listen, you can handle this, but the better decision is deviation X, Y, Z, whatever it actually moves to. And I think that framing is actually an important part of the movement process as well, because you're setting the expectation that you're trying to do everything in a more optimal way, versus just terrain trap avoidance. Like, we're just going to try to avoid the negative. You're trying to spin it into whatever the best situation possible actually is. Yeah.
And I often find that after you have those conversations and they see the difference, it's easy. That trust, there's that trust that's gained there, and that's a very valuable thing to have. Yeah, it takes a couple of cycles. Normally, when that one workout that you moved, when they friggin' crush it, then you get all the confidence in the world, and it's kind of like game over. And then they're asking you, they're like, tell me if I need to move this or not. Yeah, it's exactly what happened. Exactly. Any of you other guys had a similar experience?
Similar, yeah. And then you get these eager athletes, and you want to keep giving them the work because they're enjoying it. It's part of what they do, and just, still hold them back, right? Zoom out. There's more workouts to come. We want those to be of high quality. And like, as a coach, keeping your emotions in check, because you're getting so fired up for them and you're seeing how well training is going, and to just be patient. Remember what our job is. It's not to crush the one workout or the 1 week of training. It's to get them ready for their A event 2 to 4 months down the road.
Are you more or less sensitive to the movement depending upon like the type of workout, whether it's like a high intensity workout or a high volume workout or whatever, like have you found yourself like more sensitive to move something based on like where that workout, I'm directing this at Sarah since it's her category, based on kind of like the category of workout, right? High volume, high intensity, whatever.
So meaning if I'm sensing this fatigue or we're having these conversations and their next workout is going to be high intensity, do I slide that forward a couple days?
Well, are you just more sensitive to actually make, because at the end of the day, it's a decision, right?
Yeah.
And so you're making that decision based off of subjective feedback and not objective criteria. And so you need to decide, hey, I'm going to move this. And you can, one of the filters that you could apply, I'm not saying you have to, one of the features that you could apply to that filter is, what is that workout? Mm-hmm. Is it extremely important? Is it extremely intense? Does it have a whole lot of volume to it? And what I'm asking is does the features of the workout or the construction of the workout that you're looking at potentially moving factor into how sensitive you are on, do I need to move this or not?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So what would you be more likely to move versus keep in place?
So if fatigue is incredibly high and they're having trouble sleeping and the next workout is a high intensity workout, they're not primed and in a good position to do that. And they're also fairly, I feel like they're going to be more in a position to have negative, impact from that. So I'd rather push, maybe have a rest day and push that out and see.
But what if it's just like a long run, like a long endurance run or something like that?
That's still a tough one. If they have the flexibility for us to move that, we will. Again, if they are just sleeping 4 hours a night for 3 nights in a row, going out and doing a 3-hour run is probably not a good call, and they're not going to feel good. If it's endurance runs, those tend to be more of like, hey, those are okay. And usually if we can keep the effort good, which if I have that trust in the individual, we have that relationship, and I know they really are good about true endurance runs, they can keep that effort low. If it's an intensity run or like a high quality session where we are going after a very specific adaptation and we need to have you showing up kind of all cylinders, I'm more likely to move that one.
Yeah. I mean, based on the available research, that's a better construction. And it's really not so much can you do the workout, it's can you adapt to it, right? So under fatigue, the adaptive process is going to be blunted, and that blunting is more sensitive on the higher intensities versus on the lower intensities.
Yeah.
And you can actually go to, I know a lot of listeners are familiar with this, and you guys are familiar with this as well. Marco Altini's app, the HRV for training. When you go through that, Ryne is familiar with this because I saw him taking his heart rate variability every morning in Chamonix when we're over at UTMB. When you go through that process, there's a few different flavors of advice at the end of the run of show. So you take your heart rate variability, you go through the subjective questionnaire, and then the app takes all that information and gives you advice on what to do. And that advice is proceed as planned, limit intensity, or take the day off. Those 3. So notice it's not limit volume or, take it or take your long run easier or something like that. It's limit intensity. And once again, that's recognition of the fact that the adaptive process is blunted in these high fatigue states, particularly on the intense, in quotes, the intense types of workouts.
I appreciate you also bringing a heart rate variability for training, the heart rate because that's something that I'm going to be rolling out with athletes. I want in general, but with some of these athletes that are having these harder times making these calls or aren't as in tune, I think that's going to be a very powerful tool. So that kind of like looking forward, that is going to be something that I'm going to be adding.
Yeah, get ready to brew the morning coffee.
I know.
Well, we've been through that before.
Up at 4:30 in the morning, ready to start my day. So, but I think that will be a powerful and helpful tool for many of those athletes as well to help them assess kind of for the day.
Yeah, it's a good tool. I'll leave links in the show notes to the podcast that I did with Marco and Corinne on using that. Helpful tool, a helpful tool, yep. Not the sole driver of everything, I think is the right way to think about it, because ultimately, even when you're using only subjective feedback, it's still a human at the end of the day determining, am I going to do this next workout or not? that can be something that you roll into it if you know the proper context with it and you're taking the measurements correctly and you can get the workflow correct as well. That's actually a big consideration for a lot of coaches out there that are considering this, because the workflow part of it is absolutely absolutely integral into making sure that you can actually orchestrate correctly, because sometimes from a workflow perspective, you just can't be sensitive enough to it, since you're taking a measurement in the morning and deciding what to do with that measurement literally minutes or hours later. So all those things need to be taken into consideration, and kudos to you for incorporating that in some form or fashion. It's not as easy, and I wish it was, as waking up and going through the morning card on your Garmin.
Yeah.
The people with Garmins are familiar with this, and it'll go through all the different things and then like following that. It's not as easy as that.
No.
You've got to actually provide some sort of human interpretation.
It's a tool, not the tool.
Yeah, a tool. All right. Any more banter on Sarah's workout movement sensitivity?
And say, in regard to keeping the long run when they're fatigued, it's like, hey, it's mile 80, right? Good time for some mental training. You're tired, right? Flip it that way.
Yeah, I'm less sensitive to moving the long runs based off of a lot of fatigue. Sometimes you'll downgrade them based on time, but here's the proposition, right? Sometimes you have a long run on a day because that's the most time availability that they have, right? You're going to do a 4-hour run and it only can occur on Saturday because of life. 4 hours is a lot of time to take out of life. And you can get away with just simply downgrading either the time and or the intensity and still come up with a similar reasonable adaptation from that. So my sensitivity personally has to be a little bit higher to move those things around much. And normally I'll like downgrade first versus absolutely move, versus a hard workout, which I know I can always move somewhere else in the calendar. It's got more flexibility associated with it, and you want to move it more. I'm much more sensitive to kind of push those things around.
What you got, Koop?
Okay, you guys want to know what I screwed up, huh? Like you guys, my list is long, but I had to pick one out of all of them, and the easiest one was travel. So I have a lot of athletes that go transatlantic and sometimes trans-Pacific. So it's a big time zone change. It's a big chunk of travel. You normally are in the air for 8 to 12 hours, and the total tip to tail travel time is 16 to 24 hours. And then the time zone shift is right around 8 hours. You combine all of those things and athletes just kind of get messed up. I made a couple of mistakes this year where I did not appropriately account for the stress of the travel, meaning somebody would get to another location, US to Europe or Europe to the US, and I would throw them into harder workouts, more workload, or kind of whatever, just too soon. And too soon was the third day after they arrived. So arrival day would be day 1, the next day would be day 2, and then I would do something on day 3 in most kind of normal circumstances. I made the mistake where, for a variety of reasons, that was just too early, and very clearly too early. Athlete would go out and some got injured. Other ones was just too much. We kind of had to backtrack. And so going forward, I'm taking a kind of a 2-pronged approach to fixing this. One of them is something that I've done in the past that I'm just going to do more of. And the other one's the low hanging fruit. So the low hanging fruit is just to give more time, just give them more time once they get wherever they're going, to kind of acclimate to the time zone and things like that before kind of pouring on any sort of intensified training, intensified from the intensity perspective or intensified from the volume perspective. But the second one is I'm going to start incorporating more. I've done this before. I just have not been very diligent on it. Just using a time shifter app to shift their time zones whenever they've got transatlantic type of travel, where the time zone that they're landing in is 6 or 8 or 10 hours different from where they're used to. I'll leave a link in the show notes to that. It's a really effective app. It doesn't erase the time zone deficit. Like, let me be clear, it's not a magic wand. It makes everything perfect once you land and you can hit the ground running, but it does kind of feather the shift so that it's not as dramatic. So using that in conjunction with just general good travel habits, which honestly most of my athletes already have, I think are that's the bigger, I'm going to do this. I'm going to put a little bit more emphasis on this when I have athletes kind of go back and forth. And I was actually just looking at my athlete roster before we got on the phone. 80% of my athletes had some travel in the last 12 months that was more than 6 hours different from their home base at some point. So my point with that is it affected the vast majority of the athletes that I work with, like personally. So it's a big thing for me to have some sort of, like, not a, I don't know, I'll just say systematized way to work through that, which is get them on the time zones shifter app and then have them focus on good habits when they travel. And then even when they get there, just being a little bit more patient for when they're in their new location on the training load ramp rate going up into things.
Koop, can you, explain the time shifter app? Does it prompt you when to sleep and when to eat? Like, what exactly? Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. It's like, here's your current time zone. Here's where you're going. Here's your current sleep schedule. And then it shifts that based on those time differences. It's very, very simple. You probably don't even need an app for it, but because it can include all of the reminders and the scheduling and how long in advance you need to start shifting your sleep, it becomes a remarkably effective like behavioral tool more than anything else. At the end of the day, it's telling you when to sleep and when to wake up. It's pretty simple. And in most cases, you're incorporating it anywhere between like 3 and 6 or 7 days before the jump. So it's really not all that invasive from a scheduling standpoint. I'm not saying it's uninvasive, like people with like, kids and really strict, schedules, and I got to get, to the gym at 4 a.m. and all this other stuff are, probably gonna, freak out about it. But at the end of the day, it's kind of small changes that if you can get it close, 80% compliant, just like any other kind of training plan, can actually make a pretty big difference. And for the athletes that I know that are going, it becomes really valuable when you got a few jumps, because you can kind of work with it and massage it to accommodate, I'm going to be here for a week and then there for 3 weeks and then somewhere else for 4 weeks or something like that, which I do have a few athletes that do that. It can be really helpful on that, just to basically have their lives be less interrupted by all kind of disturbed sleep if you can get ahead of the game. You guys use that? Have you ever used it before?
I have not, but I should have when I lived in Europe and traveled back and forth all the time.
Yeah. Time shifter. I kept screwing up the
shifter.
Name. It's called time shifter, not sleep shifter. This is, I have one of two choices, either sleep or time. But anyway, I'll include a link to it in the show notes. It, like I said, it works pretty well.
Would you say, Koop, for those that can't use something like that, like those people, like you mentioned, that have kids and maybe like 4 or 12-hour shifts with their work and they can't do this, if their option is more of that push out when they start that kind of that more deep dive into the training, what have you noticed with your athletes is kind of like a good, I know it's very independent, individual, but if 3 days was maybe too soon for some people, looking back, what would you have maybe seen historically would have been better?
I mean, if you couldn't do anything, right? You had no opportunity to time shift your sleep schedule.
Correct.
The first thing I would look at is just habits when you actually sleep. If people have the opportunity to, this is going to sound like ridiculously pretentious and like I'm some sort of elitist or whatever, but if people have the opportunity to upgrade their seats to a business class seat or use points or pay for a first class seat, which I know is ridiculously expensive, but there's a lot of ways that you can jerry rig the system. I mean, United has a first class upgrade option that costs you like between $200 and $500 and 30,000 miles or something like that, which is pretty reasonable for serial travelers like myself. And I actually did this when I went to Chamonix this year, is I upgraded my seat to a first class seat because I had to give a presentation when I got there, and I knew I was going to be effed after being up for 48 hours or however long it was going to be. But anyway, my point with that is focus on the habits while you're actually traveling. That can actually make a really big difference. And then just give yourself more time than you think you need to. I think you can keep a normal hour and a half, 2 hour runs, those types of whatever's in the norm for your athlete for 2 to 3 days. Then there's no penalty for that. And then waiting to the 4th day or maybe even the 5th day of being in the new time zone to intensify things. So either throwing a hard workout and or throwing a long workout or something like that. I really think that time frame of just being on the ground is for that period of time is extremely important.
Excellent. I think a lot of people will find that helpful when they're out traveling.
I mean, once again, like it's a little bit of a luxury position, traveling kind of all around, but it is very disruptive on all different markers of health and stress and things like that. And I think we got to kind of respect that. Any new parent who's gone through that phase can like kind of recognize that. In fact, you could probably apply the same principles of just being more patient with the recovery process and with how sleep impacts things. You can apply those lessons to kind of like new parenthood as well, which none of us mentioned, by the way. I've got a couple new moms actually in my athlete roster, and that's something that I've done is just brought everything down, recognizing that it's going to be chaotic for a period of time.
For the next 18 years.
I don't think it ends there even.
Yeah, it might not for me. I was pretty chaotic for well beyond 18 years, let's put it that way. Wait, anything else on the travel?
I just wonder if potentially this could even be a future podcast as people prepare to like plan their travel for a UTMB like next year, like ahead of just like ways, like when you should plan to get there ahead of time and strategies when you get there. I mean, I think there's quite a bit of Americans that fly out there that could probably benefit from some guidance from that if they're not working with an awesome coach like us. So
yeah, I've been trying to get Amy Bender or somebody from that like sleep disruption. There's a few experts in that area on the podcast. It's definitely something that I've wanted to do. I just haven't really been very diligent at facilitating it yet.
And this can be applied to traveling within the US. If you can give yourself an extra day, also luxury, not everybody has that. Give yourself an extra day, can make a big difference. Athlete going to a race, got there the day before, brought the family, too much stress. Next race, he got an Airbnb by himself before the start. Again, that's a luxury, but if you can give yourself an extra day to settle that stress going into your race, that's something we'd all love to do.
There's this really famous sleep researcher, Sherry Ma, that I can't remember if it was her or her team who actually created this, but they created this prediction model for basketball outcomes. So who's going to win an NBA game based on what team was traveling to what time zone. And if you were to just, I'm not condoning people going to Vegas and putting their mortgage on this, but if you were just to take their predictions, it was accurate like 65% of the time or something far above the majority. If you were just to take that and lay bets down in Vegas, you'd be actually remarkably successful. Not that anybody should do it, but it kind of shows the power of how much sleep can actually impact athletic performance across a wide variety of things: endurance, skill, strength, power, all that other stuff. And we definitely need to respect it. I agree that we need to do something very specific once the Euro travel season starts around UTMB, because there's so many athletes going over there. Maybe we can package it together in a whole thing, like what to do from sleep, how to get there, and where to stay, right?
Yeah.
Like all those kind of like good habits, what to do when all your stuff gets lost. We had an athlete that happened to one of our athletes who's traveling in on like Wednesday or something like that, had all of his stuff kind of go awry. That's going to continue to happen because the airlines are pretty terrible at keeping track of our stuff. So yeah, you guys just gave me an idea for next August. We'll get that on the track. All right. I'll open the floor up. Does anybody have the burning desire to confess something else that they screwed up?
I'll jump in again.
Yeah. Nicole's swinging for the
I'm
fences.
not Catholic. This isn't in my roots, but no. Yeah, maybe like a little context on this one. As coaches, one of the first things we'll do when we're building a strategy or a long range plan, right? One of the very first things we have to do is identify the demands of a race. And it's very typical practice for us, right? Like we always put time into this. And that means looking at what is the terrain like? What is the environment like and the weather? What is the climbing rate going to be? Like this is all part of what we do normally. And I had a situation this year where I'm, like doing my research on this athlete's race, and I keep bumping up against all these like roadblocks, right? This race was international. I could not find anything in English about it. My athlete was an American, recently moved to this country. They could not find that much about it either, right? So we just keep bumping up against, it's just hard to get any information on this race. And eventually I at least could get the climbing rate. I knew how much the climbing was per mile. And you know what I mean? There was enough there to go off of. We train, she works hard, comes to the race the day of, and was shocked to find that this was actually located in a national park or a national refuge of some kind. Hundreds of people on the trails. So the trails are very crowded, constantly having to move around people. Even though we knew the climbing rate, they got there and we realized the trail was steps. You know how you can put trails are built this way, kind of like the Grand Canyon. There's sections of the Grand Canyon where it's steps and just like miles of these big giant steps. And so even though we had known about the climbing rate, we were surprised by the steps. We were surprised by the crowdedness and the people on the trail. And so now I have this athlete that's in a situation where there's a mismatch between the expectations of what pace she might run or how quickly she's going to make it through this. So there's this mismatch of expectation of performance versus the reality of the course. And then it was a mismatch between, what we had available in training in terms of, she got plenty of climbing, but the climbing steps is almost a different modality than running and walking. It's almost its own thing. And if you've ever spent time in the Grand Canyon, climbing and descending 4,000 feet of steps, it's a huge eccentric load on your calves and your soleus. And like, it really destroys you if you haven't spent time doing that. And so anyways, as a coach, I now have this athlete, he's in a situation, she's frustrated because she's dealing with people and really we just set the wrong expectation, right? Like we could have known about that. And then you're not feeling frustrated in the middle of your race because you're not doing as well as you thought. Like that could have been maybe not easily because this was hard to find information on this race, but I don't know. I think in terms of going forward and how you would fix this and what I might do better in the future is that, number one, as an athlete or a coach, like take the time and preparation to know your course and to know the demands of your goal. But like if you run up against a roadblock and if you're having a hard time finding information, there's ways to get creative, right? Like this athlete did not live that far away. We could have gotten her on the course beforehand, right? We could have sent her out to do some course recon. I think there's always ways to utilize the community. So maybe there's a language barrier, but she still has friends in the community and still has ways to reach out to people who maybe have done the race before to try to get some, some help in that way. But I don't know, just is a good reminder that you can set yourself up for success by taking the time necessary to really know the demands of your race.
The expectations mismatch is a total mind F, right? Like, because when you get out there, you're like, oh yeah, like this is 1,000-foot climb, it's at 8% grade, like whatever, you research it in training. and then like literally it's stairs instead of trail. Like, yeah, it changes the physiological demands, but more so, you're like, I thought I prepared for this, but I didn't. And that's a total mind screw for a lot of people, and kind of like rightfully so. So I think the course correction there is actually great, but then the other piece that is worth mentioning is, if you don't know, it's okay to say, you're not going to know until you get there. And so then that sets the expectation of unknown, and that's not the worst thing in the world. And so that way, if it's crowded or if it's on stairs or whatever feature that you haven't been able to kind of like quite track down, there's no expectation set. So then whatever they're encountering is kind of expected at that point, right? Because they haven't had some sort of inherent expectation in their minds in the first place. Really common with new races, right? Like I had a couple of athletes that, even with I Am Tough. So this is public knowledge. I'm not like divulging anything that people don't know. I paced Casey Lichtig for I Am Tough, which is a race that's been held for forever. The information on that race is so horrible. Like the race director is lovely. They're very nice. It's a very well-run race, but there's just not a lot of information anywhere, like about kind of like anything. The trails are actually really great out there too. And so going into that race, like not having those expectations was actually a really big advantage, because then when you got to the section that was like super steep and loose, you're like, okay, let's super steep and loose. You get to a big talus section, you're like, okay, I'm in a talus section. This is like this much of the course profile, and it's going to take me 2 hours to move over it because it's all talus. That kind of like making sure that you kind of recognize what's unknown and accepting it as the unknown is actually pretty powerful.
Well, and that's probably an important piece, whether you knew the race demands or not. Like, it's just an important piece of being an ultra runner. Like, we are going to encounter anything and everything. And yeah, be ready. Be ready to adapt.
Be ready for the unexpected, right? Things never go to plan. Adapt, as I always say. That's your best skill that you can bring to the table. All right. This was fun. Eating a little crow. We could do this all day and all night because we've made a ton of mistakes. We always try to correct them though. And I appreciate you guys being humble and honest and transparent about this, because it's not always easy to admit when you're wrong. But more importantly, I hope the audience learned a whole lot about where we're vulnerable, where we have made mistakes in the past, but more importantly, how to correct those in the future. And I think each one of us came to the table with something that's actually tangible for somebody who's going to UTMB, who's going to a race, who's never seen anything before, that's going to experience, weather changes during the year, and who's communicating with their coach about how things are going and how that actually impacts the workout flow. So very, very tangible stuff. And I appreciate you guys coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, you guys.
All right, folks, there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to our coaching staff for coming on the podcast today, swallowing their pride a little bit and going through what they did wrong and how they are going to correct it. That is not easy to do in any circumstance, but to do it publicly to an audience and all the ears are going to be turned on them is just another level. So I'm very appreciative of the staff for coming on the podcast today and enlightening me and enlightening the audience into some of the things that they've done wrong. I hope that the audience can take away something from this, regardless of whether you're in the exact same situation as any of the ones that we mentioned here, or if there's something parallel, if you are working with athletes or you're an athlete self-directing your training. You can always learn from somebody when they have, maybe not made the right decisions in some cases. I went over when I have kind of pushed my athletes too much when they are traveling, something that I am definitely going to course correct. If you like this podcast, keep in mind that this podcast is not directly monetized in any way, shape, or form. I don't bring advertisers on. I don't bring sponsors on or anything like that to pay for any of this equipment or any of the post-production or paying any of the guests. That all comes directly out of my pocket, and I'm happy to do so. I gain a lot from doing this podcast by talking to all of the wonderful guests that I've had on. But if you want to further support it, there's no better way to do that than to subscribe to my research newsletter, Research Essentials for Ultrarunning. There will be a link in the show notes to that. For $9.99 a month, you get access to a monthly newsletter that reviews 3 unique papers in the ultramarathon space that are broken down in an unbiased and unfiltered way with actual domain experts and written in plain English. The goal of which is to just level up your information in the ultramarathon space. So regardless if you're an athlete or a coach, that in of itself is a valuable resource to have, because it's hard to do this. It's hard to keep up with the research as it comes out in rapid fire succession and then proliferated across social media with all the non-experts out there. I get it if you're confused. So if you want to support this podcast or you just want to level up your game, it's a great way to actually do it. All right, folks, that is it for today. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.